Hey guys, so first order of business, I think on the same day of uploading this video, I will also be uploading my yearly Halloween Decorate With Me video. So if you'd like to see how I decorated my place and like my whole place in general, then check out this video up here. I think they're going up on the same day. If not, forgive me, but if not, it's coming. So today we're going to be doing another book to movie adaptation slash second movie slash show series of The Haunting of Hill House, originally by Shirley Jackson. I did do a couple book to movie comparisons already. My last one I did was The Ruins, so I will link it up here if you're curious. I am trying to make this a series where I read a famous horror novel and compare it to its adaptation. So like I did for The Ruins, I'll discuss the book first, kind of give a brief review of what I thought about the book, and then get into each of the movies. There's going to be two movies. We have The Haunting from 1963, which is the movie that came out 4 years after the book was released. We have The Haunting, which is a remake of that movie that came out in 1999. And of course, we have The Haunting of Hill House, which was a famous Netflix series by Mike Flanagan. So none of these are to be confused by House on Haunted Hill by William Castle. That is a completely different entity. Ironically, came out the same year that the book did, the movie did. The House on Haunted Hill movie came out the same year that The Haunting of Hill House novel came out. Really weird. Okay, so let's get into The Haunting of Hill House book review. I will have timestamps linked down below for everything. We're going to go in order of release. So this obviously came first, so we're going to work our way up to the Netflix series. The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson is one of the most famous horror, supernatural, ghost story novels of all time, and of course has inspired so many others. So the story of the novel follows an investigator of the supernatural along with 3 other people to join him at Hill House, where he hopes to find physical proof and evidence of the supernatural. The 2 women that join him at Hill House have both had experiences with the paranormal already, so he's hoping with their presence they'll be able to help him witness something. And then Luke, who is the 3rd person joining the investigator slash doctor slash researcher, is actually the inheritor of the house. And of course they do in fact begin to experience supernatural happenings within the house. Originally they kind of throw it away to logic, they kind of blame it on mental health, just mental instability, if you will. So The Haunting of Hill House came out in 1959, so it is a little bit more of a difficult read because obviously the language used by Shirley Jackson is very different to how modern books typically read now. And also the horror elements of this book are much more subtle. I feel like that's something that the 50s, 60s, maybe the 70s got a little rough in there because we have, you know, some extreme stuff in there. But the 50s and 60s really were the masters of subtle horror. So compared to today's level of horror, this book is not traditionally scary. Actually, I should say it's traditionally scary because it's kind of one of the original haunted house stories. But because they're so subtle and we live in modern times, it doesn't make this book particularly scary, even though a lot of people still to this day, like Stephen King and Martin Scorsese, see this book and this story as one of the scariest of all time. The ending of this book I find really effective. I think it's the best part of this book and definitely worth reading through to get to the end. There are slower moments because this is a more of, you know, a story focused on the characters rather than the horror, so it's not necessarily action, action, action all the time. There's a lot of character development, which I really appreciate because you can tell Shirley Jackson really focused a lot of her attention on the characters, which is one of the reasons why the ending is so effective. Also, I will say it's a pretty short book, so it's a really fast read. Of course, I love the character arc of Eleanor. She is pretty much the main character throughout all of the adaptations as well, besides maybe Hill House, because that is a completely different story compared to the source material. But Eleanor feels abandoned by her family. Her mother recently died and she was her primary caregiver for around 11 years. She doesn't really have a stable home, which is why she clings to Theo and why she starts to view Hill House as kind of her home. So you really start to empathize and feel attached to Eleanor as a character, or Nell as she is affectionately called. And I do genuinely think, although the book isn't scary to me personally, I think it's just the way it's written, and you know, I'm so used to modern horror, so it's hard to kind of find this type of book scary, I do still think the descriptions are of the paranormal stuff happening, which isn't too often, are very effective. I can see why, and I can understand why a lot of people still view this book and this story as one of the scariest. I think one of the best things that Shirley Jackson does in developing these characters is how original she makes them feel and how diverse they are, because they all feel like their own character and they're very fleshed out and you understand them and you know exactly who these people are. Like I said though, if you're gonna read it, it is written like in the 1950s, so the language is a little bit different and the horror is on the more subtle side, so it's not going to be a book for everyone, but I'm really happy and glad that I've read this now to get a reference point for the adaptations, including the Netflix series, even though that is only loosely based on this story. I just think now, having read it, I really understand the movies. So let's get into The Haunting from 1963, which is directed by Robert Wise. And out of all of the adaptations, of course, this one only came out 4 years after the novel, so it remains to be the most effective and true to the original story of all the adaptations. So it follows the same exact story as the novel, including the intro is pretty accurate. And one thing that this adaptation does that none of the other ones do is it includes a lot of Nell's internal monologues and narrative that we get from the book, but we don't actually get in the 1999 remake, and of course, you know, the Netflix one, which isn't even relevant in comparison yet, but we'll get there. Now, I'm not going to pretend that the 1960s era of horror is for me. That would be a lie. You know this by now. I gravitate more towards modern horror. I don't think there's any shame in that. I have appreciation for kind of the roots of horror though, so I can appreciate this movie for what it was. I actually really enjoyed watching this movie, and there are some 60s movies that I do genuinely love. Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, Rosemary's Baby. I really love these movies, so it doesn't really surprise me that I really liked this one because they are typically pretty well done, and I like more subtle horror anyway. Like even with modern day horror, I gravitate towards the supernatural, subtle, paranormal kind of stuff versus the like gore and slasher vibes. So it wasn't really surprising to me that I liked this, even though the era, not really my thing. It really executes the subtle scares of the book, and I think it's really effective with the effects that they did end up using for this movie. And Luke is actually my favorite character in this movie. I just think he's really funny. He has a lot of one-liners, and that kind of surprised me for the era. It even has jump scares in it, which honestly, normally I'm not a huge fan of jump scares, but in this one it works, and I loved it because it's kind of like the OG jump scares, you know? Now, Martin Scorsese has listed the original Haunting movie as his #1 spot of the top 11 scariest movies that he's seen. And while I don't agree with that at all, because although the horror elements are subtle and effective, they're not scary by today's standards, I think. It's just hard not to compare them to things I've already seen and remain objective in that. So I understand that it's a really well done movie and I really enjoyed it, but to say it's your #1 scariest movie of all time is a little bit of a stretch, but who am I to say? Maybe it is, I don't know. My favorite effect that they used in this movie was actually the bulging door scene. I'm gonna see if I can find it and kind of put it in. It's actually real laminated wood. You'd think it'd be made of something pliable, or more pliable I should say, because obviously it is pliable to an extent, but it's actually a crew member pushing on the other side of the door with a plank of wood. So I think that scene is actually so good. It's genuinely kind of scary to watch their reactions, and that is probably the most effective scene. I also really like the ending of the movie as well. It's the only one that really stays true to the book ending. Like I said, this movie is the most accurate adaptation from the book. Now, Theo is a character that remains a queer character throughout all of the adaptations, and she is in fact queer in the novel. Now, the novel is the most subtle out of all of the stories that she is in fact a lesbian. Some say that in this movie it's more explicit, which I have to kind of disagree. Maybe it's, again, today's world, it's just she's not really that obvious that she's gay in the original movie, but I do think they were successful at keeping it more implied, which I think was their intent anyway, because they didn't want to be overt with it because it was the 60s, it was a little bit of a different era. I get it. And film censors actually said they didn't even want Theo to touch Eleanor, which I find incredibly offensive. Like, why can't they? But, you know, they didn't want to make her gayness too obvious, you know, but they ignored that, and I'm really glad they did. They had her hold hands with Nell at times and hold her to comfort her and console her. So a fun fact I'm going to throw in here, because we're kind of going in order of progression of all the adaptations, I do want to mention the Stephen King adaptation. Yes, there is in fact a Stephen King adaptation of this story. So Stephen King actually attempted to remake this movie in 1990, but then had shelved the project until 2002 when he released Rose Red, which I really enjoyed. I had no idea that was even an adaptation of Hill House. Obviously, it only semi-resembles The Haunting of Hill House. It wasn't a direct adaptation or direct remake of the movie by any means. All right, now let's move on to The Haunting from 1999, shall we? Starring Catherine Zeta-Jones, Liam Neeson, Owen Wilson, and Lily Taylor. All big names. And what's funny is actually Wes Craven was originally signed on to work on this, but then eventually just dropped it, which I don't know why. I think his touch on this would have been really unique, and you know, he's a good filmmaker, and I feel like he could have added a lot to this. So this movie is also a direct adaptation to the novel with some changes. The first one being the beginning. It's definitely different. Instead of Nell, played by Lily Taylor, stealing the card, her sister and brother-in-law, I believe, gifted it to her so she doesn't have to steal anything. It does follow the same characters from the novel. So we have Eleanor Vance, which is weird because in the original movie it's Lance with an L. I'm not sure why they changed it to Vance. I don't know if that was like a misinterpretation or what. Of course, we have Theo, which is played by Catherine Zeta-Jones, and Luke, which is played by Owen Wilson, and Dr. David Marrow, played by Liam Neeson, all staying at Hill House to kind of investigate the paranormal. However, they initially lied, or the doctor lied, saying that he was doing a sleep study for those who suffer with insomnia, which in reality he was studying fear or whatever. So they changed a little bit of the backstory, but generally the characters are the same, and the general story of going to Hill House to experience the paranormal is the same. Now, again, this movie is very successful in executing the subtle horror elements. However, I obviously have to name the elephant in the room of the scares being very cheesy. This is like very goofy, cheesy horror, which, I would say it's because of the era. 1999, they didn't have great effects or anything like that, but the CGI is terrible. Like, it's so bad and definitely not scary. I would say the original is scarier than the 1999 one. It doesn't really do the book full justice, I would say. It is rated PG-13. I think it's a great beginner to horror. If anything, this one you can watch with your children, and it's not going to be too much or over the top. I feel like possibly they spent most of their budget on the casting and the set versus the effects, because it is definitely the worst part of the movie. But one thing it also does really well is that it is more of a character-driven story than a scary story, which is what you have to come to expect when you watch any variation of Hill House, I think, including the Netflix one. It's obviously more character-driven, more drama and story versus scares. Again, it does a very good job at representing the characters of Theo and Nell specifically. I think Luke kind of falls off on this one. It's my least favorite Luke of any of the stories, and they're very similar to how they're actually portrayed in the book. I think they're pretty accurate in this movie. Again, consistently keeping Theo as a queer character. In this one, she actually has a husband and a girlfriend, and the movie's also really great at showing Eleanor's character arc, who I think arguably is the most important character out of all of them. And I think reading the book actually makes this movie better. I already liked this movie prior. I'd watched it years ago before I had even read the book. I honestly didn't even know it was based on the novel by Shirley Jackson. So after reading the book, it definitely makes me appreciate the subtleness of the movie and a lot of the references to the book story. And I think altogether the universe works really well, because a lot of the stuff that's kind of not explored in this movie, like some things from the book that are omitted, are actually talked about and included in the Netflix series. So I think as a whole, the whole thing works together. You read the book, and then you watch the 2 movies, and then you watch the Netflix series, and you get kind of this whole picture of the story. So now that I've mentioned it a million times, let's talk about the Haunting of Hill House Netflix series from from 2018 by Mike Flanagan. I've done a whole video talking about Hill House and Bly Manor together, so I will link it up here if you want more like in-depth thoughts, like a review for it. Right now I'm just going to kind of do a comparison. Obviously the biggest change in the story, if you've heard me describe the story portrayed in the adaptations in the book, is that it's completely different. It does only claim to be loosely based on the novel by Shirley Jackson, because obviously this follows a family of 7 who move into Hill House to renovate it. But it was really fun after reading the novel to rewatch the series and kind of pick up on all of the homages that Mike Flanagan included in the series. I'm just gonna go through some that remain the same. Obviously Luke, Nell, and Theo are all characters in Hill House. However, they're brother and sisters in the series, and obviously they're strangers in the original story. So a cup of stars is a reference to the novel. So if you remember Nell with her cup of stars and Mrs. Dudley explaining to her, like, you drink from your cup of stars and never let anyone else blah blah blah, you know? In the night, in the dark. That's a continuation of every single adaptation uses that phrase. No one will hear you scream in the night in the dark. Like, no one, you know, lives closer than town, and no one will come even nearer than that. That's all from the book. Obviously the Dudleys are consistent throughout all adaptations and also represented in the Hill House series. The colored rooms, red room, green room, we don't get much of that or any of it, I think, at all in the 1963 movie. It was filmed in black and white, and I don't even think they really mention colored rooms like they do in the book or the 1999 one. There's mention of the red room in the 1999 movie, and of course we get the red room in Hill House. So Hugh Crane as a character himself, he plays obviously the father in the Hill House series. However, he is the original owner of Hill House in the original story. One of my favorite things that Mike Flanagan took from the book and the original movie, and also the 1999, you know, adaptation included this as well, is Welcome Home Nell. I think it's such an effective thing to put in a horror series because it's really, you know, kind of spooky. It's Nell being referenced by the house, and obviously including also the accusation of like, well, you wrote this clearly because you want attention, right? Is also, you know, derivative of the source material. Abigail as a character, you know, the little girl, spoilers for this whole video, the Dudleys' daughter. She is a character actually in the original story as well. She plays Hugh Crane's daughter. There's also tons and tons. I'm not going to sit here and list all of the homages that Mike Flanagan includes from the source material and from the original movie specifically. One of them being the 2 girls huddled in the bedroom with banging on the walls. That is in the, you know, original movie. It's also in the remake. So I'm really happy to see that he took so many homages from the original and put it into Hill House. Like I said, I reviewed the series more in depth if you want to know like more thoughts on it, and given that it's only loosely based on the source material, it's kind of hard to do a true comparison, but he did take a lot from the original novel and put it into the series, which I loved to see. Another thing that's consistent throughout all of the adaptations, the book, everything, is the spiral staircase. I like that it references the spiral staircase. We see it in every single movie and the series itself as well. Obviously Theo being kept as a queer character throughout is really nice. I'm glad that they kept that feature in because I think it's really important to the story. And also it's really interesting to see it become more and more obvious as time goes on, because obviously in the book it's way more subtle, and then we have a little bit more direct in the 1963 movie, 1999 a little bit more direct, and then obviously in the 2018 series she's just full-on gay. So it's just very obvious in that one because you just get to see the evolution of time basically, and reflecting the era of when it was filmed and what was deemed like appropriate to put in entertainment at that point. Now, one thing that I really enjoy about this whole universe and the story and everything is how you interpret it, because it is on the surface a supernatural ghost story. However, you can also see it kind of as a woman unraveling and becoming more and more unstable as she feels more and more displaced in the world. So that's why I really like Nell and gravitate towards her. Obviously, she's the main focus in most of the stories that are told. And Shirley Jackson did actually say it's not that deep, it's just pretty much a ghost story at some point. But I beg to differ. I think it has a lot more to offer than just your traditional ghost story. So there you have it, a book to movie to series comparison. I would love to know your thoughts on this series and this universe, and if I missed any remakes, of this series. I'm sure it's been referenced a million times, and there's a lot of loosely based stories referencing this book because it is so famous. I wouldn't be surprised if there's even more. But those are the main ones that I wanted to talk about because they are direct adaptations to the original classic Haunting of Hill House. Let me know your thoughts on Haunting of Hill House, any of them, if you've seen them all, if you've read the book, if you watched the series. I'd love to hear all your thoughts down below. And of course, please leave a book to movie comparison or adaptation recommendation that you want me to talk about in the future down below. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.